Imagine losing everything in a single, devastating storm. No help coming. Just you, your family, and an untamed wilderness determined to break you. This isn't a story from a century ago. It's the fight for survival this homesteading family is facing right now, against forces more powerful than anything they've ever encountered. Will their resilience be enough? The wind was a living thing, a hungry beast howling down from the jagged peaks of the Rockies. Elias felt it in his bones, a cold tremor that had nothing to do with the fading warmth of the cabin's dying embers. Outside, the world was a maelstrom of white, a furious ballet of snow and ice that blurred the line between earth and sky. It was late autumn, but this blizzard, vast and vengeful, felt like the full fury of winter arrived early, determined to claim its due. He rose from the rough-hewn chair, the creak of the floorboards a loud intrusion in the heavy silence. His wife, Elara, lay on their bed, a thin quilt pulled to her chin, her face pale even in the faint lamplight. Beside her, nestled deep in the furs, their youngest, 5-year-old Lyra, slept soundly, oblivious to the raging tempest. 10-year-old Finn, usually restless, was a still lump in his own cot, his breathing even. Elias moved to the single window, its panes thick with frost, and peered out. Nothing, only the swirling, impenetrable white. Their homestead, painstakingly built over 3 arduous years, was disappearing beneath the onslaught. The barn, a sturdy structure he'd raised with his own hands, was just a darker smudge in the churning chaos. A memory, sharp as a splinter, pricked him, the gentle curve of the valley when they first arrived, sun-drenched and hopeful. The faint scent of pine and rich earth. Elara's smile, brighter then, less shadowed by the lean years and the unspoken losses that had followed them westward. They had buried one child back in Ohio, a tiny daughter named Clara, taken by fever before her first birthday. The grief had been a silent companion on their journey, a weight they carried in the deep hollows of their hearts. This land, they'd hoped, would offer a fresh start, a clean slate. Now it threatened to erase them entirely. He touched the cold glass, his breath fogging the pain. The first signs had been subtle, an unusual chill in the air, a shift in the wind's song from brisk to mournful. Then, the sky had turned an ominous gray, a bruised canvas that promised ill. They had worked feverishly, bringing in the last of the harvest, securing the livestock, boarding up windows. But even their frantic efforts felt like tiny whispers against the mountain's roar. Elara stirred, a soft sigh escaping her lips. Elias turned from the window. Her eyes, the color of a summer sky, met his, wide and concerned. No words were needed. The fear was a shared language in their small cabin. "It's worsening," he said, his voice a low rumble, almost lost beneath the wind's shriek. He didn't need to tell her. She felt it too, the cabin groaning under the pressure, the very air vibrating with the storm's fury. Elara pushed herself up, her movements slow. She reached for the half-empty cup of water beside the bed, her hand trembling slightly. "The wood. How much do we have left?" Elias walked to the stone hearth, kicking at the few glowing embers. "Not enough. Not if this keeps up." He had spent weeks in the autumn, felling trees, splitting logs, stacking them high against the south wall of the cabin. But the blizzard had caught them off guard. A sudden, brutal descent. What seemed like a plentiful supply now felt tragically meager. Lyra whimpered in her sleep, a small, lost sound. Elara's gaze softened as she looked at her youngest. "We'll be all right, Elias. We always are." Her voice was laced with a resolve that Elias admired, a quiet strength that had seen them through countless hardships. It was the same strength that had held them together after Clara, that had urged them west, that had kept them digging roots from the unforgiving soil when hunger gnawed. But Elias saw the worry etched around her eyes, the tight set of her jaw. He knew she was as afraid as he was. More so, perhaps, for their children. He moved to the small table, where a single flickering candle cast dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. He picked up a worn wooden carving, a small bird with outstretched wings. Finn had made it for Clara, a childish offering of hope. He still kept it, a silent sentinel against forgetting. The wind suddenly intensified, a violent gust that rattled the entire cabin. A shower of snow sifted through a gap in the window frame, dusting the sill. Elias knew with a chilling certainty that this was no ordinary winter storm. This was something ancient, elemental. He walked back to Elara, kneeling by the bed. He took her hand, rough and calloused from years of toil, and squeezed it. Her skin was cool. "I'll go to the barn in the morning," he said, his voice firm. "Check on the livestock. See if I can gather more wood from the stack." Elara's grip tightened. "You can't. Not in this." "I have to," he insisted, his gaze unwavering. "We can't just sit here and wait for the cold to take us." He saw the silent argument in her eyes, the fear for his safety. But she also saw the necessity, the grim truth of their situation. He was their last defense against the wilderness. The night dragged on, an interminable stretch of biting cold and the relentless howl of the wind. Sleep was a restless thing, punctuated by the cabin's groans and the occasional whimper from Lyra. Elias spent most of it feeding the fire sparingly, watching the flames struggle against the creeping chill. He thought of his father, a man of few words but immense resilience, who had taught him to read the signs of the land, to respect its power. He thought of the stories of pioneers who had perished in similar blizzards, swallowed by the vast indifferent landscape. He would not let that happen to his family, not while he still drew breath. Dawn, when it finally arrived, was a weak, bruised light filtering through the snow-choked window. The storm had not abated. If anything, it had intensified. The wind, a banshee's scream. The snow falling in thick, blinding sheets. The world outside was a featureless white expanse, deep drifts piled against the cabin, burying it almost to the eaves. Elias rose, his muscles stiff, his heart heavy. He pulled on his thickest wool coat, wrapped a scarf around his face, and donned his heavy gloves. Elara was already awake, watching him with an anxious intensity. Fend, too, was stirring, his young eyes wide with concern. Lyra was still asleep, a small island of innocence in a sea of worry. "Stay close to the fire," Elias instructed, his voice low. "Keep the children warm." He tried to project a calm he didn't feel. He took a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs. The door, when he finally wrestled it open, released a torrent of snow into the cabin. He braced himself, then stepped out into the blizzard, the door slamming shut behind him, cutting him off from the fragile warmth of his family. The force of the wind was staggering, an invisible fist that tried to push him back. The snow was waist-deep in places, soft and treacherous. Every step was a battle, his legs sinking into the drifts, his progress agonizingly slow. The air was a biting, frozen mist that clung to his eyelashes, blurring his vision. He squinted, trying to make out the faint outline of the barn, only a few yards away but lost in the whiteout. He pressed forward, relying on instinct and memory. He remembered the exact number of steps from the cabin door to the barn, the slight dip in the ground, the solitary pine tree that stood sentinel near its corner. He walked with his head down, shielded by his hat and scarf, pushing against the relentless wind. The cold seeped into his bones, numbing his fingers and toes. He focused on one thing, his family's survival. They needed heat. They needed food. After what felt like an eternity, his outstretched hand finally scraped against something solid and rough. The barn wall. Relief, sharp and sudden, flooded him. He fumbled for the latch, his gloved fingers clumsy with cold. The wind shrieked through the gaps in the planks, a mournful lament. Inside, the air was still frigid, but it offered a measure of shelter from the immediate assault. He slammed the door shut, leaning against it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could barely see in the gloom, the small windows completely caked with snow. He stumbled through the darkness, calling out for their cow Bess and the two goats, Daisy and Clover. Their low moans and bleats answered him, reassuring sounds in the oppressive silence. They were alive. He reached the stalls, his hands finding the rough hair of Bess, her warm flank a comfort. He checked their feed, their water. They were low, but there was still enough for a day or two. The stack of hay, thank God, was inside the barn, well protected. Now, for the wood. He knew where the woodpile was, just outside the barn's eastern wall, stacked high and covered with a canvas tarp. Getting to it, though, would be another harrowing journey through the storm. He found a shovel in the corner of the barn, a heavy, unwieldy tool. and pushed open the small side door. The wind slammed into him again, more fiercely this time, almost knocking him off his feet. He began to dig, shoveling snow away from the wood pile. The work was brutal, back-breaking, his muscles screaming in protest. The snow was dense, heavy, almost like wet concrete. Each scoop felt like lifting a boulder. His face was numb, his hands aching inside his gloves. He could feel the frost biting at his exposed skin, despite the layers. He dug for what felt like hours, the world a suffocating white blur. His mind, usually sharp, became a dull hum of pain and exhaustion. He thought of Elara, of Finn and Lyra, huddled by the dwindling fire. He had to keep going. He couldn't fail them. Finally, after an eternity of digging, he unearthed a corner of the canvas tarp. He tore at it, revealing the neatly stacked logs beneath. He dragged several to the barn entrance, then struggled to carry them back to the cabin. The journey was even harder with the heavy load, his footing unsure, his strength waning. He repeated the process, a slow, grueling shuttle between the woodpile and the cabin, each trip a desperate gamble against the elements. The wind seemed to mock him, snatching his breath, trying to push him down. He felt a profound isolation, alone in a world gone mad. He focused on the warmth of the cabin, the faces of his family, an anchor in the storm. By the time he finally collapsed inside the cabin, his arms laden with the last load of logs, he was shivering uncontrollably, his skin a mottled blue-red. Elara rushed to him, her eyes wide with fear and relief. Finn helped her peel off his frozen outer layers. Lyra, awake now, looked at him with innocent, questioning eyes. "You're freezing," Elara whispered, rubbing his hands vigorously. She wrapped a thick blanket around him, pulling him close to the now flourishing fire. He huddled there, letting the heat slowly seep back into his frozen limbs, the warmth a profound blessing. "It's bad," he managed, his voice hoarse. "The drifts are too deep. Can't reach the main supply. This is all I could get." He gestured to the small pile of logs he'd managed to bring in. It was enough for another day, maybe two, if they were careful. But the storm showed no signs of letting up. Elara knelt beside him, her face grim. She knew what that meant. They were trapped. Their supplies, already stretched thin, would dwindle rapidly. The cold, relentless and unforgiving, would become their enemy within the cabin walls. Days bled into a week, each one a grueling test of their endurance. The blizzard raged ceaselessly, a white wall beyond their windows. Their world shrank to the confines of the small cabin. Food became scarce. Elias rationed everything, a careful, measured portion for each meal. The children, usually boisterous, grew quiet, their energy slowly ebbing. Lyra often shivered, despite the blankets. Finn, ever watchful, helped his mother with chores, his young face etched with worry. The dwindling wood supply was a constant, gnawing fear. Elias spent hours by the hearth, stoking the embers, trying to coax every last spark of warmth from the precious fuel. The temperature inside the cabin dropped steadily, the breath of the children visible in the air. Elara kept them wrapped in every available blanket, telling them stories in a low, soothing voice, trying to distract them from the cold and the hunger. One afternoon, as the wind howled its loudest, a new sound cut through the din, a faint, mournful whimper from the barn. Bess. Elias's heart clenched. He had not been able to get back to the barn since that first desperate trip. The snowdrifts outside were now insurmountable, towering walls of white. But Bess, their sole cow, was their lifeline. Her milk had been a crucial source of nourishment for Lyra, even now. "What is it?" Elara asked, her voice tight with apprehension. "Bess," Elias said, his gaze fixed on the snow-covered window. He could imagine her, trapped and freezing, her strength fading. "She's in distress." Elara's face crumpled. "You can't go out there, Elias. You'll die." He knew she was right. The drifts were too high, the wind too strong. Even if he could reach the barn, he might not be able to get back. But the thought of Bess suffering, of losing their last source of sustenance, was unbearable. He stood up, a fierce resolve hardening his features. "I have to try," he said, his voice flat. He was a man fighting for his family, pushed to the edge of what was humanly possible. This was not about heroism, it was about desperate survival. Elara grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "No, Elias, think of the children. What if you don't come back?" Her eyes pleaded with him, mirroring the terror in his own heart. Finn, who had been listening silently, spoke up, his young voice surprisingly steady. "I'll go with Pa." Elias looked at his son, seeing a flicker of his own determination in the boy's eyes. Finn was small, but he was hardy, resilient. Still, the thought of exposing him to the storm was agonizing. "No, son. It's too dangerous." "I can help," Finn insisted. "I'm strong. I can carry things." Elias hesitated, torn. He knew, deep down, that he might not make it alone. The sheer physical exertion, the blinding snow, the crushing cold. 2 pairs of hands, even small ones, would be better than one. He looked at Elara, a silent question in his gaze. She looked from her husband to her son, her face a mask of anguish. But she also saw the grim necessity. "Be careful," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Both of you." Elias nodded, a silent promise. He helped Finn bundle up in every available layer, tying a scarf around his small face, pulling his hat low. He gave Finn a small rope, tying one end to his own belt. "Hold on tight," he instructed, his voice gruff. "Don't let go, no matter what." Stepping out into the blizzard with Finn was like entering a different world, a swirling, malevolent void. The rope connecting them was a thin thread of hope in the overwhelming white. Finn, surprisingly, moved with a quiet determination, his small hand gripping the rope tightly. He stumbled often, but he never let go. The journey to the barn was a nightmarish crawl. Elias led the way, pushing through the towering drifts, breaking a path for Finn. The wind ripped at them, clawing at their clothes, trying to tear them apart. The cold bit into their flesh, a relentless, aching pain. Elias's lungs burned, his muscles screamed, but he pushed on, driven by the thought of Bess and the fragile lives waiting back in the cabin. Finn, despite his fear, did not cry. He just kept moving, a small, resolute figure battling the elements. Elias would occasionally turn, making sure his son was still there. A quick nod of encouragement. He saw the terror in Finn's eyes, but also a nascent strength, a will to survive. Finally, battered and exhausted, they reached the barn. The door, nearly buried, took all of Elias's remaining strength to pry open. They stumbled inside, gasping for breath, their bodies trembling violently from the cold and exertion. Bess was lying in her stall, her breathing shallow, her eyes dull. She was weak, barely able to move. The cold in the barn was almost as biting as outside, the straw in her stall frozen stiff. She needed warmth. She needed food. Elias knelt beside her, his heart aching. He checked her udder. It was barely producing milk. He knew what he had to do. They couldn't save her here, but they couldn't let her die in vain. He looked at Finn, his face grim. "We need to get her inside, son." Finn's eyes widened. "The cabin?" Elias nodded. "It's our only chance, for her and for us." Moving a weakened cow through waist-deep snow in a raging blizzard seemed an impossible task. But Elias, with Finn's surprisingly strong assistance, began the arduous process. They coaxed Bess slowly out of her stall, gently prodding her forward. She was heavy, her movements clumsy, but she seemed to understand the urgency. The return journey was even more brutal. Bess struggled in the snow, her legs sinking, her vast weight making progress agonizingly slow. Elias and Finn pushed and pulled, their strength dwindling with every step. The wind screamed its fury, tearing at them, pelting them with ice. At one point, Bess stumbled, collapsing into a drift. Elias thought they had lost her, but with a surge of desperate energy, he and Finn managed to haul her back onto her feet. He kept talking to Finn, low, encouraging words, telling him they were almost there, just a few more steps. He saw the tears freezing on Finn's cheeks, but the boy kept pushing, kept pulling, his small body straining. It was a sight that would forever be etched in Elias's memory. His son, a mere boy, fighting with the tenacity of a seasoned survivor. When they finally staggered back to the cabin, pushing the protesting Bess through the narrow door, Elara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The sight of her husband and son, caked in snow and ice, half frozen, dragging a cow into their living space, was both horrifying and profoundly moving. Lyra, who had been huddled by the fire, stared with wide, unblinking eyes. The cabin was instantly filled with the scent of hay and wet fur, the lowing of the cow, a strange new sound in their confined world. Elias and Finn collapsed by the fire, shivering violently, their ordeal finally over. Elara, tears streaming down her face, quickly wrapped them in blankets, pressing warm cloths to their frozen faces. Bess, surprisingly calm, settled in a corner of the cabin, her large body radiating a welcome warmth. Elara, with Elias's instructions, managed to milk her, the warm, creamy liquid, a precious gift. Lyra, with a small, hopeful smile, drank deeply, the nourishment a balm to her frail body. The blizzard raged for 3 more days, but inside the cabin, a fragile sense of hope had taken root. They had Bess's milk and her warmth. Elias and Finn, though still exhausted, slowly recovered. The children, with the added nourishment, began to regain some of their color. The fear was still there, a constant companion, but it was tempered by a newfound sense of resilience. They had faced the wilderness and, against all odds, they had endured. On the morning of the 11th day, the wind finally died down. An eerie silence descended upon the valley, broken only by the soft crunch of melting snow. Elias, his body still stiff, cautiously opened the cabin door. The world outside was transformed. Towering drifts, sculpted by the wind into surreal shapes, surrounded them. The landscape was a pristine, untouched white, sparkling under a brilliant, cold sun. The sky, a vast, clear blue, was breathtakingly beautiful. The storm had passed. He stepped out, sinking into the deep snow, and breathed in the crisp, clean air. It smelled of pine and ice, of fresh beginnings. He looked back at the cabin, his home, a small, defiant island in the vast wilderness. Elara stood in the doorway, Finn and Lyra beside her, their faces pale but hopeful. Bess, still inside, let out a soft moo. They had lost much. Their harvest was likely ruined, their animals in the barn probably dead from the cold. The hard work of years lay buried under a mountain of snow. But they had each other. They had survived. Elias walked over to the snow-covered remains of his garden, its neat rows of vegetables now a buried memory. He saw the fallen branches, the sheer scale of the devastation. The road to recovery would be long, arduous, and filled with new challenges. But as he looked at his family, huddled together in the cabin doorway, a quiet strength settled in his heart. They were survivors. They had faced the untamed wilderness, endured its brutal fury, and emerged, not unscathed, but unbroken. The losses were immense, the scars deep. But in the silence of the snow-covered valley, under the vast, clear sky, Elias knew one thing with absolute certainty. They would rebuild. They would persevere. For the land, unforgiving as it was also their home, and they were its resilient, determined inhabitants. Their homestead might be battered, but their spirit remained unyielding. They had fought for survival, and they had won, in the hardest, most profound way imaginable. If you enjoyed this incredible tale from the frontier, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories from the American West. Click on the video on the screen for another tale we think you will love.